For decades, conservatives promoted free trade and getting government out of the way of business as part of the recipe for raising all boats on the river of economic prosperity. But in light of growing gaps in American society, that argument is now finding opponents not just on the left, but also on the right. Oren Cass is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and his new book is one such argument. It's called The Once and Future Worker, a vision for the renewal of work in America. And Oren Cass joins us now. Thanks for making the trip up to Canada.
Thank you for having me.
Nice to meet you. I want to start by quoting something right out of your book. Here we go. Sheldon, would you bring up this graphic, please? America is like the classic romantic comedy heroine who, as the trailer intones, had it all, or so she thought. She has the prestigious job and the elegant apartment, and yet she is not happy. She has pursued the wrong goals, she discovers, and to reach them, she sacrificed the things that mattered most. Let's pick up on that. What do you think America has sacrificed that matters most?
Well, we've sacrificed the foundations of a stable society, which at the end of the day, it's built on work. It's built on people's abilities to find productive opportunities, to support themselves and their families, contribute to their communities, and then raise another generation that's ready to do the same thing. And as we've pursued this economic model that says growth at all costs, essentially, we're going to grow the economic pie. It doesn't matter who grows the economic pie. We can send money to everybody who's left behind. That worked on its own terms. We did grow the pie. We do send money. Everyone does have more stuff than ever before. But we didn't pay attention to what was happening to people along the way. And for those who have been left behind, it has not worked out at all.
Why do you think?
Well, I think because it comes down to that idea that work is so important. The way that we do economics, the way we do public policy, what our culture tells us is that consumption is what matters. And we measure everything in terms of consumer welfare. And look, I love consumption too. I'm not here to say growth is bad or, I think rising material living standards are incredibly important and we should value them. But when you look at what's actually most important to people, especially once you get above some sort of basic level of material goods, production actually matters at least as much, if not more, than consumption. So it matters for individuals, it matters for self-esteem, for mental health, for life satisfaction. It matters for how your kids do. It matters for whether you form a family in the first place, whether your family stays together. And if we ignore that and just say, as long as everyone can consume more stuff every year, we're doing well, we're like that romantic comedy heroine. We do all consume more stuff, and yet we're not doing well.
It has apparently been 15 years since the majority of Americans told the Gallup surveying organization that they are satisfied with their country, and the suicide rate has climbed 24% between 1999 and 2014. What is going on?
Well, I think data like that are really important to keep in mind to supplement the traditional economic picture. Especially in the wake of Trump's election, a lot of economists looked around and said, what's going on? All of our data tells us people are better off than ever. So do they not understand that they're better off? Are they too racist and xenophobic to care that they're better off? But then when you widen that lens, you realize, no, they're clearly not better off. You see rising levels of social dysfunction, which are most pronounced in those measures of suicide, of substance abuse, of people just saying they're not happy with where the country's going. You see it also in social indices of lower marriage rates, of higher share of kids being raised outside of wedlock. And so I think it's really important to take all of that to supplement the GDP per capita and say, if you take a much richer view of how life is looking for people out there, what they're telling us is actually really important. And if it doesn't align with the economic data, the problem's not with them, it's with the way we're looking at the data.
Do you know, it's interesting. I'm going to come back to the GDP in a bit because I know you're not a fan of how that measures prosperity. Several months ago, we did an interview here. In that chair was Chris Hedges. You and Chris Hedges probably agree on very little, although your books are very similar in diagnosing what's wrong with America today. Do you find that curious that he's widely regarded as being one of the prophets on the far left, and you're not, and yet you agree on so much? Why is that?
Well, I think it's a little bit heartening to see that people from very different places on the political spectrum can actually agree on sort of the facts. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think certainly there are plenty of people across the political spectrum who don't, who choose facts based on where they want to go. But at the end of the day, the actual facts about what's happening in the world are the facts about what's happening in the world. And I think, across the Western world, and especially in the United States, the facts are pretty stark, and they have been for a while. And even on economic measures, when you get away from the aggregate and start looking at, for folks without university degrees, for folks who aren't living in cities, you start to see things just aren't going very well.
And yet, I do want to come back to that GDP, the gross domestic product, as a measurement of economic growth and how well society is doing. 1,000 times a day we hear in media that that's the way to measure things. You don't think so?
It is a way to measure things. It's part of the picture, but it's important to keep in mind that I think, to look at its history and realize that, for centuries there was no such thing as measuring GDP in a sense. It actually emerged in our response to the Great Depression, when measuring the total capacity of the economy and where it was headed was incredibly important. And then as we went from that into World War II, whose economy could make the most stuff, really was an existential question.
Yes.
And so GDP is great at telling you that, and it should be part of the picture. You want rising GDP, you want your output to be growing, but it also hides a lot of things. Within that rising GDP number, there's the composition of GDP. So there's what are we making more of, and then there's the composition of GDP in terms of who is making it. And as the biggest aggregate picture, it is the best one at obscuring what's actually happening in society and allows you to have ever fewer people contributing ever more of the GDP. And there's no way from looking at the number to see what's happening to the other people.
Well, it certainly doesn't measure wellness or happiness, does it?
Well, and then
Not necessarily.
That's exactly right. And then and that goes a little bit to the composition point, which is, I always point out, if a high-priced divorce lawyer moves back to his hometown to take care of an aging parent, GDP goes down. So there's that problem that even not all economic value is necessarily created equal. But then it actually turns out that GDP, market goods that we consume, is such a small share of everything that dictates how we feel about life. We've talked about the production component. How do we feel about our work? But then there's also, where are we able to live? Can we build the kind of life we want in the kind of community we want? Can we stay near extended family if we want? If one parent wants to be staying at home with the kids, can one parent support the family? If both parents want to be working, is that an option? All of those things, for almost anyone, if they think about their own life, again, once you're above that basic subsistence level, those are really the most important things, and GDP is not going to tell you what's happening with that.
So if that constitutes the good life, as you've just described it, at what point do you think, and I'll use America as a train as a metaphor, when did the train get off the tracks in your view?
Well, I think the train diverged from the tracks in the 1970s. Most of the economic data, along with most of those other indices, all look kind of great together in the post-war period into the 1970s. And then you start to see this real divergence on both kind of digging into the economic data, where some people continue to do very well, but a lot of people sort of leveled off. And then in some groups, you even start to see declines. And then that's also where you see really the trends starting to worsen on all those other social indices that we've talked about. I think it was still really masked, and we sort of made do and kept going along until roughly the financial crisis. I think the financial crisis, as crises do, sort of laid bare a lot of the underlying problems. And that's when we started to realize how far off the track of a sustainable kind of strong society we'd really gone.
Whom do you blame more, Republicans or Democrats, for this predicament?
I blame them equally, and I blame them equally because I don't think the problem was a particular set of Republican or Democratic policies. I think it was an approach to public policy making that both sides started from. I mentioned this idea of kind of the economic pie. Again, that's not something that has always been with us. The economic pie emerges as this metaphor in the post-World War II period, when that was how we'd become accustomed to thinking about things. And then you find almost every president, Democrat, Republican, talking in these terms. We're going to grow the pie so everyone can have a bigger slice. Because who doesn't like pie, right? New York Times and Wall Street Journal editorialize about growing the pie. Right of center, left of center think tanks talk in these terms. That was the sort of basic framework. And what we fought about was what's the best way to grow the pie and how much sort of cutting and redividing of the pie should we do. And that is the model that then came to dominate in the late 60s into the 70s, and that you see carried right through really up until Trump's election, when he was the first one who wasn't talking in those terms at all.
Well, that's what's, I guess, a little bit confusing for those of us who've watched the Republican Party for many years, because to the best of my knowledge, it always stood for lower taxes, smaller government, no tariffs, free trade, that kind of thing. How much of that accurately reflects Republican sentiment today?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between Republican elected representatives and Republican voters. And I think that's one thing that became especially clear in 2016, that the orthodoxy that you've just described, that was held uniformly among the political class, was not necessarily what the voting base actually cared most about. Not that they disagreed with those things, not that they were for high taxes and bigger government necessarily, but that those weren't necessarily their instincts or their priorities. I think at this point, you've started to see a little bit of shift within the political class. Particularly those folks who pre-2016 were already sort of taking a critical look at some of these questions, wanting to think a little bit more deeply about them, have really been liberated to do that now. But you still have an awful lot of elected representatives in particular who, they've spent their whole career in the pre-2016 model. It's not the sort of thing that just flips.
It is amazing. Trump in 3 years has managed to basically upend 75 years of traditional Republican approach to governing.
That's certain.
Okay, I was going to say something, but I won't say it. I'll ask you. What do you think of that?
Well, I would challenge your characterization a little bit. He personally has. If you look at what his administration and government have actually done in the interim, the major legislation that was passed was a tax cut.
No, that's a fair point. Yeah.
The major sort of, at the administrative state level, the major action has been deregulation. Obviously, you have examples where he has taken a very different approach on trade. He's spoken differently about immigration, although it's not clear how much policy has actually moved on the question. And so I think it goes to exactly that divide we were just talking about, where he absolutely sounds nothing like traditional Republicans, but you also still have that traditional Republican political class that is still the pre-Trump group. And an awful lot of them, I think at this point, still have an attitude of kind of, well, if we keep our heads down, this too shall pass, and things can go back to the way they were before.
I want to play a clip here as we consider work and the future of work and what the working class may look like going forward. Historian Yuval Noah Harari, was on the program a couple of years ago discussing all of that. And let's see a clip of what he had to say, then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
The rise of artificial intelligence, even without genetic engineering, is already threatening of pushing more and more humans out of the job market. So within 20 or 30 years, we may see the rise of a new massive class, the useless class. Just as the Industrial Revolution created the urban working class, so the new revolution will create the useless class. People who are not just unemployed, but unemployable. And the social and political implication of that could be catastrophic. You could have billions of people without economic importance and without political power.
The useless class. What do you think?
I think he's completely wrong. I think it's sort of an attention-grabbing claim that just doesn't have very much evidence to support it. I think it's really important to recognize that when we talk about technological progress and automation and artificial intelligence, we're talking about ways to bring technology into the economy that allows you to make more stuff with fewer people. In other words, you're increasing the productivity of the people who are working. So we actually measure that very carefully. It's one of the things GDP-related measurement is good for. You can measure what's happening with output per hour of work. And it's slowing. productivity growth is slowing. Productivity growth in the Western world has been declining over time. In the US, it's pretty much at a record low. And so the idea that we are sort of in this era of accelerating technological change that's leading toward these sort of ever greater disruptions is just incorrect. Now, looking ahead, obviously, there's no way to prove the negative and say it is impossible that the things he's describing will happen. But I think it's really important to understand the reasons why it is not happening, the reasons why it's never happened with past technology, and to at least use that as the basis for our view of what's going to happen going forward.
Well, okay, let me, for argument's sake, push back a little bit here, in as much as we do have a group of people in North America today, all over the world, frankly, who are undereducated, who are mostly white men who can't get jobs, and who have given up looking for work. And I guess one of the points he makes is that group is going to be further and further left behind as society gets more and more complicated. And I guess it raises questions about whether we need some kind of universal basic income or guaranteed annual income so that this group of people isn't completely left on the ash heap of history. What's your view on that?
So they are not actually being left behind by technology, I think is the important thing to understand. So if we take that exact group you're talking about, and let's take kind of manufacturing as the quintessential sector. So in the United States, manufacturing productivity growth, the rate at which we reduced the need for labor in manufacturing, was highest in that post-war period, 1947 to 1972. It was 3.4% annually. And yet during that period, we added 4 million manufacturing jobs.
That is not what people think.
Well, actually, if you ask them what they think about that period of time, it is what they think.
Well, but they'd probably think that it's never been worse than it is today.
Well, and they are correct, but why did we add jobs with productivity growth? Because output growth went up more, right? If you think about, okay, people can make twice as much stuff as they used to. You have two choices. One is to use half as many people to make the same stuff. The other choice is to use everybody and make twice as much stuff. And that used to be the model. We got the productivity growth, we made more stuff. And that is the formula for rising well-being, rising wages, rising material living standards. What has happened if you look at the 2000 to 2018 period, productivity growth was lower. It was 3.1% instead of 3.4%. And yet we lost 5 million manufacturing jobs. Now, why is that? Again, it's not because productivity growth looked different. It's because instead of growing output at 4.2% per year, we grew output at 1.3% per year. And now we're down jobs. So what's changed, what's leaving all those workers on the sideline isn't some change in how technology is operating in the economy. It's a change in how the economy is operating. It's a change in where our investment is flowing toward, what kind of businesses we're building.
Do we need to save those people then with a universal basic income of some kind?
No, we need to return to an economic model where we invest in expanding businesses and building the kinds of firms and technologies and jobs that will demand their labor, just as we have through every era. I mean, it's interesting that that Mr. Harari mentions kind of the Industrial Revolution, right? You could have told the exact same story about the Industrial Revolution. Everyone used to work on farms, and then all of a sudden, we needed almost none of those people on farms anymore. So why weren't they a useless class? They weren't a useless class because we had our entrepreneurs and investors and the broader economy. And that's not just sort of, Silicon Valley. I'm talking about small business owners, talking about the entire process of a dynamic economy. It's not just about the disruption that changes how things are going today. It's also about the recycling of those people into new things.
We found something else for them to do.
That's right. And that's what we've lost, is now instead of investing in new opportunities for workers, we have a model where we send ever more of our most talented people, our investment dollars, into a narrow set of financial and tech industries in a narrow set of cities. And there's nothing in economic theory or nothing about technology that says it has to be that way. We just have to recognize that it matters. We have to recognize that growing GDP with that model is not as good and is not sustainable as compared to a model where GDP is growing in a broad-based way that spreads prosperity widely.
In which case, tell us what productive pluralism is.
So productive pluralism is a description of what we should be trying for. And it has two words. There's the productive, which we've been talking about a lot in terms of focusing on work and people's ability to be productive contributors. And then there's pluralism, which we've also talked about in the idea of what defines the good life, that people are going to have different definitions of the good life. And so, for instance, saying, well, you could still get a job, you just have to move to a big city and learn to code or something, right? Historically, we've been able to sustain a wide variety of options of lifestyles, and some people want to live in big cities, some people want to live in small towns, some people want to journey off in search of opportunity, some people want to stay near their families. Historically, you could choose those different things, and having those choices is itself part of a prosperous society. And so what we should be defining as success is not just how big can we make the pie. It should be this productive pluralism. It should be a pie that, yes, we want it to be getting bigger, but it's getting bigger in a way that everyone participates in productively. And it's getting bigger in a way that preserves those kinds of choices across society instead of driving people into ever narrower segments.
Would that require the subsidization of the wages of particularly lower income people?
So I do think we should consider a wage subsidy.
How do we do that?
The best way to do it is with what we call a direct wage subsidy, meaning that you look at what somebody's hourly wage is, and if it's below a certain level, so in the US, you'd say, like, if you're below $15 an hour, let's say, we are going to make up half the difference between your wage and $15 an hour. So if you made $10 an hour, there's an extra $2.50 an hour in your paycheck. And
from whom?
From the government. The reality is, in the United States, even more so in most other Western countries, we spend enormous amounts of money. A very small share of it would be required to fund that kind of wage subsidy. The problem is that the way we spend it today, either it disregards work, or in a lot of cases, it actually discourages work because we take it away when you start working. And so one of the key ideas in this shift from just grow the pie and send checks to everybody left behind to something focused on work is to say more of the support we provide to people should be tied to work. It should be, first of all, by doing a wage subsidy, you make it more attractive to take a job. You make it more attractive for employers to offer jobs of those types. And then you also get more money to those households, but you're getting the money to the households in a way that's attached to their productive contributions instead of in spite of them.
You are a bit tough on this, Oren, I have to say, in the book. So can I quote you here? Idleness, you write, idleness should bring a sense of failure and some measure of shame. That not working is a drain on society that harms families and communities. There's a bit of naming and shaming that I think sounds inherent in what you're talking about here. Do you mean to say that?
I do. When you check very carefully every sentence in the book before it goes off to press.
I just mean that's a very politically incorrect thing to advance in this day and age, and you obviously have no hesitation doing it, and I wonder why.
Well, I don't have any hesitation, and the reason I think is that it's important to focus on the cultural side of this equation also. That, a lot of our kind of what you'd call culture war debates are these kind of very amorphous moral challenges. But in the context of work, culture actually has very tangible, concrete effects, because when you think about why people work, what value they get out of work, one piece of it is the paycheck. But we've already been talking about all the other things that you get that are associated with work, and among them is the sense of having fulfilled an obligation, played the role that you were expected to in society, attained the level, a level of respect from within your community, provided for your family, and that's part of the reward of work. And if you take that away, if you either strip the dignity away from a lot of jobs, which I think we have done in this society, or you say we have just as much dignity and respect on offer for people who aren't doing a job, that is every bit as tangible an effect on work as cutting a paycheck.
Despite what it sounds like, I'm not actually arguing with you here. We actually had a social democratic premier in this province almost 30 years ago who said we've got to stop paying people to stay home and do nothing. So there is a recognition that work is important. Right?
There is, and that's why, on the one hand, you're right that it's politically incorrect. On the other hand, I don't think it's actually very controversial. And that's one of the things that gives me some optimism when we talk about this cultural side of the question, is that with so many of our kind of cultural issues, you have sort of entrenched partisans on each side who are, there's nothing they're angrier about and disagree more on than the cultural question. When it comes to work, if you actually elevate it to something worth thinking about, there turns out to be incredibly little disagreement. And I always point to the example in the US, I think it made it north of the border, there was a former star of The Cosby Show named Jeffrey Owen. And he was photographed bagging groceries at Trader Joe's, at one of our grocery stores. And a tabloid sort of tried to use this to like, look at this former TV star bagging groceries. And the outpouring of outrage for what was being termed job shaming, and from Hollywood celebrities, how dare you suggest that there's something wrong with this person doing honest work, doing something useful in his community, supporting his family. He was on Good Morning America talking about this. It was this incredible moment of cultural unity. There was no one on the other side of, yeah, that's right, that is a lame job. He should feel bad about himself. And so if you actually lift this up and say, hey, this is a problem that we're really not according sufficient respect to a lot of kinds of work, and we're not recognizing that work and not work are different things that we should talk about differently, everyone agrees about that. It's just a matter of actually pointing out to people that it matters, that sending contrary messages has costs, and that actually elevating this better message can have real benefits.
I do want to understand, though, very clearly what you're saying, because do you believe in 2019 that someone who has only a high school education should be able to make a living wage, be the sole breadwinner in their home, be able to afford a house, a car, and an annual vacation, and do it all in the hometown in which they grew up?
Yes.
You do?
Well, so, I mean, it's funny that this is even a question, right?
Of course it's a question today.
Well, can we agree that was possible in 1970?
I don't know. I think we can agree it was possible in 1950. I don't know if it was possible in 1970.
Most of the economic, things went pretty well between 1950 and 70. But even if we want to say 1950, if we can agree it was possible in 1950, and since 1950, from everything we've heard, we have been on this incredible winning streak in the Western world of technological progress, economic progress, rising wealth. We are so much better off. And yet if the answer to that question has changed from yes to no, that would be crazy. It would mean that everything we've said about our progress over the last 70 years is actually wrong.
Well, it would mean nobody needs to go to university anymore.
Well, to say that somebody needs to go to university is a very strange claim. Why would someone need to go to university? I think there are a lot of reasons someone should want to go to university. There are a lot of benefits to going to university. But I don't know why we would say someone needs to go to university, and we'd better not say everyone needs to go to university, because most people are not going to succeed in a university.
Well, okay, I should have said post-secondary.
Well, post-secondary, I think that's a good distinction, because when you talk about someone with just a high school degree, what I meant in answering your question was not he walks out the door with his high school diploma and never learns anything or obtains another skill. There's certainly a lot of additional skill development that needs to occur for people to be productive. By the way, there was in 1952, at any point in time. Now, one thing that was different was that high schools used to instill a lot more practical skills. And so one thing I do think we need to change is to say, instead of just making our high schools university prep programs, and then if you don't go to university, we kind of say, oh, oops, sorry, that's what we did with you for the last 4 years. You have to say to people during their high school years, look, we have different options for you here too. If you're someone who wants to head down toward university track, we know what that looks like. But for an awful lot of folks, we owe you an option that looks differently. We're still going to get you your core academics, but we're going to get you introduced to different industries early on, maybe in 10th grade. We're going to get you some on-the-job experience in 11th grade. And maybe in 12th grade, we'll still have you in the classroom or in an internship some of the time, but we can actually put you into a college sooner if you know what you'd like to be training for. So part of our obligation is to say, when you're done with high school, if you're not headed to university, you already come with a lot more than what we think of as what someone finishes high school with. Part of it is having other post-secondary programs. Sometimes it's college. A lot of times it should be something that is much more on the job. And that's something that employers used to do a lot more of. was actually invest in the sort of career trajectory of the person after they showed up. And so that can be a piece of the puzzle too. It's not that, once you know whatever it is they teach in high school these days, that's all you ever need to know. But we can't be headed toward a society that says all of those things that you described are contingent on having a university degree. Because if you're telling me that going from 1950 to 2020 meant that went from yes to no, then you're saying we've gone backward. And I don't think we've gone backward. I think we've made a lot of progress that's going to make people's opportunities a lot better in 2020 if we think about things the right way, if we get the policy environment right. But that's going to require changes from how we've been doing things.
I would like to read a statement here by a well-known American and just get you to tell me whether you agree with the sentiment in this statement. We can navigate the changes ahead if we embrace economic patriotism and make American workers our highest priority, rather than continuing to cater to the interests of companies and people with no allegiance to America. Agree or disagree?
I agree with that statement from Senator Warren.
Ah, you're good. Okay. Yeah, that was Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. I guess you would know that. You're from Massachusetts, right?
Well, her economic patriotism phrase is extremely distinct because most people would say economic nationalism, but she couldn't say that, so she had to come up with her own term.
But what does that say, given where you are on the political spectrum and where she is on the political spectrum, that you two are essentially in agreement on something this fundamental?
Well, I think to your point earlier, I think it was Chris Hedges who you were saying also, folks across the political spectrum can agree on some of our challenges and on the direction we need to move in the abstract. And so I agree entirely with many of the things that she says about the economic challenges that we face.
Are you the same guy who worked for Mitt Romney's campaign?
I am the same guy who worked for Mitt Romney's campaign. I think you'd find a lot of people who agree with that. The problem that Elizabeth Warren in particular and a lot of the Democrats in the United States have is there's no willingness to put their money where their mouth is. They're happy. I mean, you can go back, every Democratic, presidential candidate for probably ever has talked about the importance of jobs and these things. The question is whether you're actually willing to make any trade-offs for it. Right? Traditionally, everyone says they're for jobs and they have a jobs plan, but coincidentally, the left of center jobs plan is always a climate change plan and a healthcare plan that happen to be good for jobs. And the Republican plan is always a tax cut plan and a deregulation plan that happens to be good for jobs. And there are times when all those things may or may not be good for jobs, but it's not actually about the jobs in a sense. And the way you tell that is you flip it around and you find places where there are actually conflicts, where some other value conflicts with the interests of workers. And what you find, especially in the Democratic Party right now, is that as soon as a conflict actually emerges, the workers suddenly drop below whatever the other topic is. And that's the problem.
Let's finish up on this. If the approach that you're suggesting is not taken up by whichever party forms government over the next several decades, what kind of future do you see in your country?
Well, I think we're going to see an increasing level of what we would typically call populism, meaning politics that is oriented toward appealing to the issues and problems that people are especially concerned about, but not necessarily with a lot of concrete or useful solutions. And that can go on for a long time.
So Trump's not a blip then?
I don't think Trump is a blip. I think Trump himself is a blip. I mean, he's an anomaly in so many ways in the American political system. But you look at how close Bernie Sanders came to winning the nomination in 2016. Many people would consider him a favorite this time around. I think it's hard to envision going back to a day where the things that Mitt Romney and Barack Obama were talking about in 2012 are winning the day. And so, in one sense, that gives me optimism. I think, something constructive that Trump did was to really elevate a lot of the things that were the serious problems that we had not been grappling with and that deserved more focus in the political process. The question is whether we are going to bring along with that an effective response. And as I said, I'm pessimistic right now about what the Democrats are doing. Republicans, there are a lot of fights, kind of what does post-Trumpism look like? And what I'm trying to do is offer one vision of what that could be.
That response, if people want to find out more, is in The Once and Future Worker, a vision for the renewal of work in America. It's brought Oren Cass to our studio today from his home in Western Massachusetts. We thank you very much for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you for having me.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.